Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it, and sometimes that chance comes in the form of three frightened animals who refuse to give up hope. For 62-year-old Jeremiah Pike, that moment arrived during the worst flood Montana had seen in decades. The old mountain man was trying to save what little he owned when he spotted three donkeys clinging to a floating piece of wood. They were scared and cold, but they wouldn't abandon a wooden crate they carried with them. Inside that crate was a child's stuffed bear. These animals were protecting something precious, and Jeremiah knew they were trying to lead him somewhere important. With the flood waters rising and no way out, the donkeys seemed to know exactly where they needed to go. But could three animals really lead him to a family that needed saving? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass compass had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now it sat on Jeremiah Pike's kitchen table like a silent reminder of all the paths he'd never taken. Every morning for the past 15 years, he'd wake up in his cabin on Whisper Ridge, make his coffee black and strong, and watch the sun paint the Montana Valley below in shades of gold and amber. The compass always caught that first light, its polished surface winking at him as if it knew secrets he'd forgotten. At 62, Jeremiah had grown comfortable with solitude. His weathered hands knew every inch of the traplines that snaked through the high country, and his keen eyes could read the mountains like other men read newspapers. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down the valley, and that suited him just fine. He'd built this life deliberately, one careful choice at a time. After the world had taught him that people you love have a way of leaving when you need them most. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 28, just 6 months apart, and the grief had driven him up into these mountains where silence was honest and the only promises made were by the changing seasons. He'd never married, never had children, never really tried to build the kind of life that required trust in tomorrow. The mountains didn't make promises they couldn't keep. The cabin itself was a testament to his philosophy of self-reliance. Every log had been cut and fitted by his own hands, every stone in the fireplace placed with the kind of patience that comes from having nowhere else to be. The roof was cedar shakes he'd split himself, and the windows faced east and south to catch the best light. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built to last through whatever weather the mountains could throw at it. This morning felt different, though. The air carried a heaviness that made his old bones ache, and the wind had been restless all night, prowling around the cabin like something searching for a way in. When he stepped outside to check his weather instruments, the barometer told him what his instincts already knew: a storm was coming, and it was going to be a big one. The valley below stretched out like a green carpet, dotted with the occasional ranch house and barn. Cottonwood Creek meandered through the center, usually no more than 20 feet wide and shallow enough for cattle to cross. But Jeremiah had lived here long enough to know that creek had teeth when the mountain snow melted fast or when the spring rains came hard. The old-timers in town still talked about the flood of '78, when the water had reached the second story of the grain elevator and swept away 3 houses and a bridge. He spent the morning securing everything that could blow away or wash away. His traps came down from the trees and went into the reinforced shed he'd built against the back slope of the ridge. The generator got checked and fueled, extra batteries went into the emergency kit, and he moved his truck to higher ground, even though the cabin sat a good 100 feet above the valley floor. By noon, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, and the wind was bending the tops of the pine trees. The radio crackled with weather warnings, a late spring storm system moving in from the Pacific, loaded with moisture and moving fast. They were calling for 6 to 8 inches of rain in the next 24 hours, with most of it falling in the first 12. In the mountains, that meant trouble. Jeremiah had seen enough storms to know this one was serious, but he'd weathered plenty of them before. His cabin was built on bedrock, and he had enough supplies to last 2 weeks if necessary. What worried him wasn't his own safety, but the folks down in the valley who might not be as prepared. The Hendersons had that new baby, and old Mrs. Martinez lived alone in that little house right by the creek. As the first fat raindrops started to fall, he made one last check of his preparations. The compass caught his eye again as he passed the kitchen table, and for a moment he found himself thinking about the grandfather he'd barely known. The old man had been a prospector, always chasing the next claim, the next strike that would make his fortune. He died when Jeremiah was 7, leaving behind nothing but stories and that brass compass. Funny thing about paths, his father had told him once, holding the compass up to the light. You can follow them or you can make your own. But either way, you need to know where you're headed. Jeremiah had made his own path, all right. Straight up into these mountains and away from everything that could hurt him. But as the rain began to fall in earnest and the wind howled around the cabin walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that the compass was trying to tell him something. Something about directions he'd never considered, paths he'd been too afraid to take. The storm hit with the kind of fury that reminded him why the old Blackfoot called this place the Land of Shining Mountains. The rain came down in sheets, driven by winds that screamed through the peaks like banshees. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled through the valleys like the voices of angry gods. But his cabin held firm, and Jeremiah settled in by the fire with a cup of coffee and a book, listening to the storm rage outside. He'd always been good at waiting. Trapping required patience, and mountain living had taught him to take things as they came. But something about this storm felt different, felt personal somehow. The compass seemed to catch every flicker of firelight, spinning its tiny dance on the table, and Jeremiah found himself thinking about all the places he'd never gone, all the people he'd never met, outside. The rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the creek beginning to roar. The animals were donkeys, he realized as they drifted closer to his position. 3 of them, gray and brown, their ears laid back against the driving rain as they clung to what looked like a front porch that had been torn away from someone's house. Between them sat a wooden crate, small and weathered, that they seemed to be protecting as fiercely as they were protecting themselves. Jeremiah had seen plenty of animals in distress over the years, deer caught in fence wire, elk trapped in early snow, bears with their paws caught in old traps. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. The donkeys weren't just trying to survive, they were working together, taking turns, holding on to the makeshift raft while the others rested. And that crate, they kept nudging it back to the center of their floating platform. Whenever the current tried to pull it away, the current was carrying them toward a section of the valley where the flood had backed up against a natural dam of fallen trees and debris. If they got caught in that tangle, they'd either drown or be crushed by the massive logs that were piling up like pickup sticks. From where he stood, Jeremiah could see they had maybe 10 minutes before the current swept them into that death trap. He found himself moving before he'd consciously made the decision, half running and half sliding down the muddy slope toward the edge of the flood. His practical mind was listing all the reasons this was a bad idea. He didn't have proper rescue equipment, the water was moving too fast, he could easily end up in the same predicament as the animals. But something deeper than logic was driving him now. Something that had been sleeping for 15 years and was just now waking up. The compass bounced in his pocket as he picked his way through the flooded timber at the water's edge, looking for a way to reach them. The donkeys had seen him now and were making sounds he'd never heard before, not braying exactly, but something more urgent, more human somehow. They were calling to him, asking for help in the only way they knew how. 20 yards out, a partially submerged cottonwood tree offered a bridge of sorts into the current. If he could get out to the end of it, he might be able to reach them when they floated past. It was dangerous as hell, but it was the only chance they had. The tree trunk was slick with mud and algae, and the current tugged at his legs as he inched his way out, testing each step before committing his weight. Halfway out, he could hear them clearly now, 3 distinct voices calling across the water, and underneath their cries, a sound that made his chest tight. One of them, the smallest of the 3, was making a noise that sounded almost like crying. Not the mechanical bray of a working animal, but something that spoke of loss and fear and desperate hope. The current brought them close enough for him to see their eyes, wide and intelligent and fixed on his face with an intensity that hit him like a physical blow. These weren't just animals following instinct. They were thinking, planning, hoping. The largest of the three, a grey with a white blaze on his forehead, seemed to be steering their makeshift raft toward the tree where Jeremiah waited. "Easy now," he called to them, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "Easy, I'm going to try to help you." The grey donkey's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and for a moment their eyes met across the churning water. In that instant, Jeremiah felt something shift inside him, some wall he'd built cracking like ice in spring. These animals trusted him, were counting on him, and the weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and somehow necessary. The current swept them within arm's reach, and Jeremiah lunged forward, grabbing for the edge of their floating platform. His fingers found purchase on the wet wood just as the grey donkey bit down gently on his sleeve, not to hurt, but to help, to make sure he didn't lose his grip. Working together, they managed to guide the makeshift raft toward calmer water near the shore. But the effort cost them. The platform tilted dangerously, and the wooden crate slid toward the edge. All three donkeys lunged for it at once, their combined weight nearly capsizing their refuge. Jeremiah reached out instinctively and caught the crate just as it was about to tumble into the torrent. The crate was heavier than he'd expected and solidly built despite its weathered appearance. But what stopped him cold was what he felt when his hands closed around it, a slight shifting inside, like something soft and light rolling against the walls. Something that didn't belong in a flood, something that had been carefully protected and was being protected still. "What have you got here?" he murmured, and the donkeys seemed to understand that he was talking about their precious cargo. The grey one nuzzled the crate gently, then looked up at Jeremiah with eyes that seemed to say, "This is why we're here. This is what matters." Getting all four of them, 3 donkeys and 1 stubborn mountain man, to solid ground took the better part of an hour. The animals seemed to know they needed to work with him, following his lead as he guided them through the shallows to a rocky outcrop that offered safety from the rising water. But even as they found refuge, their attention kept returning to the crate, never letting it out of their sight for more than a few seconds. Once they were all on dry ground, Jeremiah got his first good look at what he'd rescued. The donkeys were in better shape than he'd expected, cold and scared, but not injured. They were clearly well cared for animals, with healthy coats and the kind of trust in humans that spoke of gentle handling. But they were also clearly lost, far from wherever home had been before the flood changed everything. The crate that had captured their devotion was made of weathered pine, with rope handles and a hinged lid that was held shut by a simple wooden peg. Carved into the top, almost worn smooth by years of handling, were the initials MR in a child's careful script. Below the initials, someone had carved a rough outline of a heart. Jeremiah looked from the crate to the 3 donkeys, who were watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. They wanted him to open it, he realized. They were waiting for him to understand whatever it was they were trying to tell him. With fingers that shook slightly from cold and something else he didn't want to name, he worked the wooden peg free and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a bright yellow towel, was a child's stuffed bear. It was soaked through despite the crate's protection, and one of its button eyes was hanging by a thread, but it had clearly been loved. The fur was worn smooth in places from countless hugs, and someone had sewn a small red heart onto its chest. The moment he lifted the bear from the crate, all 3 donkeys moved closer, pressing against him as if to confirm that yes, this was what they'd been protecting. This was why they'd fought the current, why they'd risked everything to keep their floating platform steady, why they'd called to him across the water for help. "Whose bear is this?" he asked them softly, and the grey donkey, who seemed to be their leader, made a low sound in his throat and looked downstream, toward the heart of the flood zone. The implications hit Jeremiah like a cold fist in his stomach. If these animals had been protecting a child's toy, if they'd gone to such lengths to keep it safe, then somewhere in this chaos was a little girl who was probably looking for both her animals and her bear. Somewhere in the flood zone was a family that was missing the three creatures who'd just risked their lives to save a stuffed animal. The rain was still falling, the water was still rising, and now he had 3 donkeys and a mystery on his hands. The smart thing would be to wait it out, to keep the animals safe until the flood receded and someone came looking for them. But as he looked at the bear in his hands, and then at the 3 pairs of eyes watching him expectantly, Jeremiah realized that the smart thing and the right thing weren't always the same. The compass in his pocket seemed to grow warmer, and for the first time in 15 years, he found himself wondering if maybe it was time to follow a different kind of direction. Donkeys wouldn't leave the bear. Jeremiah had tried everything he could think of to get them moving toward higher ground and shelter. He'd coaxed, he'd tugged gently on what looked like makeshift lead ropes around their necks. He'd even tried walking away to see if they'd follow. But every time he moved more than a few feet from where he'd set the crate, all 3 animals would plant their feet and refuse to budge. "Come on now," he said to the grey donkey, who seemed to be their spokesman. "We need to get you somewhere warm and dry. That bear isn't going anywhere." But the grey, he'd started thinking of him as Jasper, though he had no idea why, just fixed him with those intelligent brown eyes and made a sound that was half grunt, half sigh. It was a sound that clearly meant, "You don't understand. We can't leave without her, not it." As if the bear was more than just a toy, more than just an object to be protected. As if it represented someone who mattered, someone who was counting on them to keep her safe. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the wind was still vicious, and all 4 of them were soaked to the bone. Jeremiah's practical mind kept insisting that they needed shelter, food and warmth before anything else. But the longer he watched the donkeys' behavior, the more he began to understand that they weren't thinking about their own comfort. They were thinking about something else entirely. It was the smallest of the 3, a brown Jenny with white patches around her eyes, who finally helped him figure it out. She kept picking up the bear with her teeth, carrying it a few steps in one direction, then setting it down and looking back at him expectantly. When he didn't respond, she'd pick it up again and take a few more steps, always in the same direction, downstream, toward the heart of the flood zone. "You want me to follow you," he said, and all 3 donkeys' ears pricked forward as if they'd been waiting for him to catch on. "You think you know where she is, don't you? The little girl who owns this bear." The Jenny, he found himself calling her Patches, made a soft whickering sound and nuzzled the bear gently before picking it up again. This time, when she started walking, Jasper and the 3rd donkey, a sturdy brown male Jeremiah had dubbed Buck, fell in behind her. They were about 50 yards downstream when Patches stopped suddenly and set the bear down, her ears swiveling forward like radar dishes. She'd found something, caught in a tangle of brush that had been swept against a boulder. A small red object that didn't belong in the wilderness. A child's rain boot. Jeremiah's heart lurched as he waded into the shallow water to retrieve it. Size 12, bright red with a pattern of yellow ducks around the top. It was the kind of boot a 6- or 7-year-old might wear, and it hadn't been in the water long. The rubber was still clean, with no sign of the algae and mud that would have accumulated after hours in the flood. "She was here," he said aloud. And Patches made that soft sound again, the one that sounded almost like crying. Recently, he turned the boot over in his hands, looking for any clue about where it might have come from. Inside the heel, written in permanent marker in a child's careful printing, were the letters MR, the same initials carved into the wooden crate. The donkeys were watching him intently, and when he looked up from the boot, he saw something in their expressions that made his chest tight. They weren't just animals who'd gotten separated from their owners in the chaos of the flood. They were members of a family, and they knew their family was in trouble. "All right," he said, tucking the boot into his jacket. "All right, we'll look for her. But we need to be smart about this. The truth was, he had no idea how to be smart about searching for a missing child in the middle of a flood. His experience was with tracking animals through wilderness, reading sign in mud and snow, following clear trails through country he knew like his own backyard. This was different. This was chaos and moving water and terrain that changed by the hour as the flood reshaped the landscape. But the donkeys seemed to have a plan. Patches picked up the bear again and started moving downstream, following the edge of the flood zone where debris had collected. Every few hundred yards, she'd stop and sniff the air, then adjust their course slightly. Jasper and Buck flanked her like outriders, their heads constantly moving as they scanned for threats or obstacles. They were hunting, Jeremiah realized. Not for food or shelter, but for scent, for any trace of the person they were looking for. And they were good at it, better than he would have expected from domestic animals. As they made their way along the flood's edge, more evidence began to emerge. A child's jacket, bright blue with reflective strips hanging from a fence post that was half submerged. A small backpack, the kind used for school, caught in the roots of an overturned tree. Each discovery made the donkeys more agitated, more determined to push forward, despite the dangerous conditions. The jacket told Jeremiah more than he wanted to know. It was torn, and there were scratches on the waterproof fabric that looked like they'd come from sharp branches or debris. Someone had been moving fast through rough country, probably in the dark, probably scared out of their mind. "She's not alone," he said to the donkeys, and Jasper's ears swiveled toward him. "The jacket's too big for a little kid. Someone older was carrying her, or at least helping her." That should have been reassuring, but somehow it made him more worried. If an adult had been with the child, where were they now? And why had they left behind things that a scared little girl would never willingly abandon? The backpack yielded more clues. Inside, protected by a plastic bag, were school papers with Maria Rodriguez, written in careful cursive at the top. Math worksheets for second grade, a reading log with gold stars next to finished books, and a drawing of 3 donkeys standing in a green field. At the bottom of the picture, in the same careful printing he'd seen in the boot, were the words, "My friends Jasper, Patches, and Buck." "Well, I'll be damned," Jeremiah murmured, looking from the drawing to the 3 animals who were watching him with what could only be described as patience. "I got your names right, but the drawing told him more than just their names. It showed a little girl who loved these animals enough to draw them, to name them in careful letters, to think of them as friends rather than just livestock. And now those friends were risking their own lives to find her, following a trail that only they could detect through country that would challenge an experienced tracker. The afternoon was wearing on, and the temperature was dropping. They needed shelter, and they needed it soon. But every time Jeremiah tried to steer them toward higher ground, the donkeys would resist, their attention always pulling back toward the flood zone and whatever scent trail they were following. Finally, as the light began to fade and the rain started to fall harder again, Jasper made the decision for all of them. He picked up the bear, taking over from Patches, who was clearly tiring, and led them to a rocky overhang that offered some protection from the weather. It wasn't much, but it was defensible, and it gave them a good view of the valley below. As they settled in for what was likely to be a long, cold night, Jeremiah found himself studying the 3 animals who had somehow become his companions. They took turns standing watch, never all resting at the same time, and they kept the bear between them like a sacred object that required constant protection. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about finding a lost child. For these donkeys, it was about family, about loyalty, about promises that mattered more than their own comfort or safety. And somehow, without quite knowing how it had happened, he'd become part of that family, bound by the same promises and the same desperate hope that they weren't too late. Dawn came grey and reluctant, filtered through clouds that still promised more rain. Jeremiah woke to find Patches standing guard, while Jasper and Buck rested, the bear tucked safely between them like a sleeping child. His back ached from the hard ground, and his joints protested as he stretched. But the donkeys were already alert, ears swiveling towards sounds only they could hear. The flood had receded slightly during the night, revealing a landscape that looked like the aftermath of a war. Trees were down everywhere, their roots torn from earth that had turned to soup. Fences hung in tatters, and the remains of buildings jutted from the muddy water like broken teeth. But it was what the receding water had revealed that made Jeremiah's breath catch in his throat, caught in the branches of a cottonwood that had been stripped bare by the current. Fluttering like a white flag of surrender was a piece of fabric. Not just any fabric, this was fine cotton, the kind used for children's clothing. And it was clean, too clean to have been in the water for long. Patches had seen it too. She was already moving toward the tree, the bear clamped gently in her teeth when Jeremiah caught up with her. The fabric was part of a nightgown, torn along one seam but otherwise intact. It was white with small pink flowers, sized for a child of 6 or 7. "She's alive," he said aloud, surprising himself with the relief in his voice. Someone got her out of those wet clothes. But the relief was tempered by a growing concern. If Maria had been wearing this nightgown when the flood hit, it meant the family had been caught at home, probably in the middle of the night. They'd had time to grab the donkeys and some essentials, but not much else. And if they'd been moving through this terrain in the dark, with a frightened child and rising water everywhere, Jeremiah pulled the wooden crate toward him and opened it again, this time looking more carefully at its contents. The bear wasn't the only thing inside. Wrapped in the folds of the yellow towel was a small photograph, its edges warped by water, but the image still clear. It showed a young girl with dark hair and bright eyes, standing between the 3 donkeys in what looked like a farmyard. She was wearing the same nightgown that now hung from the tree, and her smile was the kind that could light up a room. But it was what he saw in the background of the photo that made his pulse quicken. Behind the girl and the donkeys, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was part of a building. Not a house, but something older, with stone walls and a distinctive arched doorway. He'd seen that architecture before, during his occasional trips to town for supplies. The old mission, he breathed. San Miguel Chapel. The chapel sat on a rise about 3 miles downstream, an abandoned remnant from the days when Spanish missionaries had tried to establish a foothold in this valley. It had been built to last, with thick stone walls and a foundation that had weathered more than a century of mountain storms. If someone needed shelter from a flood, and if they knew the country well enough to find it in the dark, Jasper made a low sound in his throat. And when Jeremiah looked up, he saw that all 3 donkeys were staring at him intently. It was as if they'd been waiting for him to make this connection, waiting for him to understand where they needed to go. "You know, don't you?" he said to them. "You know where they are." The response was immediate. Patches dropped the bear long enough to nuzzle his shoulder, while Buck moved to stand beside the crate as if ready to carry it. Jasper was already looking downstream, toward the direction where the old chapel waited, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The most direct route was still underwater, and the higher ground was a maze of fallen trees and washouts that would challenge even experienced hikers. With 3 animals to guide and a wooden crate to protect, the journey would take most of the day, assuming they didn't run into trouble along the way. Jeremiah studied the terrain, plotting the safest route in his mind. They'd have to swing wide to the east, following the ridgeline until they could drop down into the valley near the chapel. It would add miles to the trip, but it would keep them on solid ground and away from the worst of the flood damage. As he worked out the details, he found himself thinking about the decision he was making. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether his cabin would survive the storm. Now he was planning a dangerous rescue mission based on nothing more than a photograph and the behavior of 3 donkeys who seemed to understand things he couldn't explain. It should have felt crazy. Instead, it felt necessary, like something he'd been preparing for without knowing it. The compass in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and for the first time since his parents died, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The donkeys had already started packing themselves. Buck positioned himself so that the crate could be secured to his back with the rope Jeremiah carried in his pack. Patches took charge of the bear again, while Jasper scouted ahead, testing the footing and looking for the safest path up the slope. They worked together like a team that had been training for years, each animal knowing its role without need for direction. Jeremiah found himself following their lead more often than giving it, trusting their instincts in ways that would have seemed impossible just a day before. The climb up to the ridge was harder than he'd expected. The storm had turned the normally sure footing into a slippery mess of mud and loose rock. More than once, he found himself grabbing onto Jasper's solid bulk for balance, and the donkey never shied away or seemed to mind the extra weight. From the ridge, they could see the full scope of the disaster. The valley floor was a brown sea dotted with debris, and whole sections of forest had been flattened by the force of the water. But in the distance, rising like an island from the flood, was the stone bulk of San Miguel Chapel, its walls dark with moisture but still standing. And there, barely visible against the stone, was a thin wisp of smoke rising from what might have been a small fire. "Someone's there," Jeremiah said, and felt his heart leap with something that might have been hope. "Someone's alive." Patches made that soft crying sound again, but this time it didn't sound like grief. This time it sounded like joy. The journey toward the chapel tested every skill Jeremiah had learned in 34 years of mountain living. What should have been a straightforward hike became a careful negotiation with terrain that seemed determined to kill them. The flood had undermined ridges that had been stable for decades, turning solid ground into treacherous slopes that could give way without warning. Twice they had to backtrack when paths they'd counted on proved impassable. Once Buck nearly lost his footing on a stretch of shale that had been turned into a waterfall by runoff from the peaks above. But each time they faced an obstacle, the donkeys seemed to find a solution, picking their way through the chaos with an instinct that bordered on supernatural. It was during one of their rest stops, as Jeremiah checked the makeshift harness holding the crate to Buck's back, that he noticed the collar around Jasper's neck. He'd seen it before, of course, but hadn't really looked at it. Now, studying it more closely, he realized it wasn't just a functional piece of equipment. It was something made with care and love. The collar was braided rope, but someone had woven colored threads through it to create a pattern. And hanging from it was a small brass bell that chimed softly with each step. The bell was old but well-maintained, and when he lifted it to examine it more closely, he could see an inscription etched into the metal: "Para mi amigo Jasper con amor," for my friend Jasper. "With love, she made this for you, didn't she?" he said to the big grey donkey, and Jasper's ears swiveled forward as if he understood every word. "Maria made this collar." The thought of a little girl carefully braiding rope and threading colored yarn, working for hours to make something special for her favorite animal, hit Jeremiah harder than he'd expected. It painted a picture of the kind of bond he'd never experienced himself, the pure, uncomplicated love between a child and her animals. His own childhood had been different, practical. His parents had been good people who'd worked hard and provided well, but there hadn't been much room for sentiment on a working ranch. Animals were tools, valued for what they could do rather than who they were. The idea of spending time decorating a donkey's collar would have seemed like foolishness to his father, but looking at Jasper now, seeing the careful way he carried himself to keep the bell from jangling too loudly, seeing how he turned his head to listen when Patches or Buck made the slightest sound, Jeremiah began to understand that maybe his father had been wrong about some things. Maybe there was value in bonds that couldn't be measured in productivity or profit. They were making their way down a steep slope when the first real danger found them. A section of hillside that looked stable suddenly shifted under Buck's weight, sending a cascade of rocks and mud tumbling toward the valley below. The donkey scrambled for purchase, the crate bouncing dangerously on his back. And for a terrifying moment, it looked like he might follow the landslide down the mountain. Jeremiah lunged forward without thinking, grabbing Buck's halter and throwing his own weight against the slide. His boots skidded on the loose ground, and he could feel himself being pulled toward the edge along with the struggling animal. Then Jasper was there, his solid bulk braced against them both, while Patches grabbed the rope securing the crate and pulled back with all her strength. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, they fought the mountain's attempt to claim them. Rocks bounced off Jeremiah's shoulders, and he could taste mud and fear in equal measure. But gradually, inch by inch, they pulled Buck back from the edge and onto solid ground. When it was over, they all stood there breathing hard, covered in mud and shaking from adrenaline. But what struck Jeremiah most was how naturally they'd worked together, how each of them had known exactly what to do without any discussion or direction. They'd become a team, bound together by something stronger than mere circumstance. That was close, he said aloud, checking Buck over for injuries. The donkey was scraped up but unharmed, and more importantly, the crate was still secure. Inside, the bear and the photograph had survived the tumble intact. Jasper made a low sound and nuzzled Jeremiah's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to say, "We're all right. We're together. We keep going." And they did keep going, even as the afternoon wore on and their destination seemed to retreat before them like a mirage. The chapel was visible from the ridge, but getting to it required navigating a maze of washouts and fallen timber that turned every mile into an obstacle course. It was during one of these detours, as they picked their way around a pile of debris that had once been someone's barn, that Patches made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been ranging ahead as usual, nose to the ground, when she suddenly froze and made a sound Jeremiah had never heard before, a low, urgent call that brought Jasper and Buck running. She'd found a backpack, adult-sized and made for serious hiking. It was caught in the branches of a juniper bush, and when Jeremiah worked it free, he could see that it had been packed in a hurry. The contents told a story he didn't want to believe. Emergency medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, a flashlight with dead batteries, energy bars and water purification tablets. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, a driver's license for Elena Rodriguez, age 34, with an address that matched nothing in his mental map of the valley. The woman in the photo looked tired but determined, with the same dark eyes and bright smile as the little girl in the photograph from the crate. This was Maria's mother, and she'd been prepared for trouble. But if she'd dropped her medical supplies here, it meant she was either hurt or had found someone who needed them more. "She's trying to get to the chapel too," Jeremiah said to the donkeys, who were watching him with the kind of attention that made him uncomfortable. But something went wrong along the way. Jasper moved closer and rested his great head against Jeremiah's shoulder, a gesture that somehow conveyed both comfort and urgency. They needed to keep moving, but they also needed to understand what they might find when they reached their destination. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the flood-ravaged landscape in shades of gold and shadow, Jeremiah found himself thinking about families and the lengths people would go to protect them. Elena Rodriguez had been carrying emergency supplies in the middle of a disaster, which meant she'd been thinking ahead, planning for contingencies. But she'd also been willing to drop those supplies when something more important demanded her attention. The chapel was close now, maybe another hour's walk if they could maintain their pace. But with each step, Jeremiah found himself wondering what they would find when they got there, and whether the smoke they'd seen was a sign of hope or something else entirely. The chapel stood silent against the evening sky, its stone walls dark with moisture but undeniably solid. From their position on the hillside above, Jeremiah could see that his instincts had been right. This was where someone would come for shelter. The building sat on a natural rise that had kept it above the floodwaters, and its thick walls would provide protection from both weather and debris. But something was wrong with the picture. The smoke they'd seen from the ridge was gone now, and there were no signs of life around the building. No movement in the windows, no sounds carrying across the water. Just silence and shadows, and the kind of stillness that made his gut clench with worry. Patches had found something else, though. Tucked into a crevice between two rocks, protected from the rain by an overhang of stone, was a child's drawing. Not the careful artwork from the backpack, but something hastily sketched on a piece of torn cardboard, with what looked like a burnt stick from a fire. The drawing showed 3 donkeys standing next to a building that was unmistakably the chapel. But it wasn't the subject matter that made Jeremiah's hands shake as he held it. It was the message scrawled in a child's uncertain letters along the bottom. "Mama is hurt. Please help us. Jesus," he breathed, and all 3 donkeys pressed closer to him as if they could sense his distress. "How long ago do you think she drew this?" Jasper made a low sound and began moving down the slope toward the chapel, his brass bell chiming softly with each careful step. The message was clear. They'd found what they were looking for, but they needed to hurry. The approach to the chapel required them to cross 50 yards of muddy ground that was studded with debris and standing water. Jeremiah tested each step carefully, feeling for solid footing, while the donkeys spread out in a line behind him. Buck, still carrying the precious crate, stayed in the middle where the others could help if he got into trouble. Halfway across, Patches suddenly veered toward what looked like another pile of flood debris. But as they got closer, Jeremiah realized it wasn't debris at all. It was a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and pieces of torn tarp. And from inside came a sound that made his heart race. The weak but unmistakable voice of a child singing, "Jesus me ama." Bien lo sé, su palabra me lo dice a mí. The Spanish lullaby was barely audible, sung in a voice that was hoarse with exhaustion and fear. But it was the most beautiful sound Jeremiah had heard in 15 years, because it meant they weren't too late. "Maria," he called softly, not wanting to frighten her. "Maria, are you in there?" The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete he could hear his own heart beating. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, "Who's there?" "My name is Jeremiah. I'm here with your friends Jasper, Patches, and Buck. They've been looking for you." The response was immediate, a scrambling sound from inside the shelter, followed by a small face peering out through a gap in the tarp. Maria Rodriguez was even smaller than he'd expected. Maybe 6 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. She was dirty and scared, but when she saw the 3 donkeys, her expression transformed into something approaching joy. "Jasper!" she cried, and scrambled out of the shelter on hands and knees. "Patches, Buck, you came back!" The reunion was something Jeremiah would remember for the rest of his life. The 3 donkeys surrounded the little girl, nuzzling her gently, making soft sounds of welcome and relief. Patches immediately dropped the bear at Maria's feet, and the child clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. But even as he watched the happy reunion, Jeremiah's eyes were searching for Elena Rodriguez. The shelter was small, barely big enough for 1 adult and a child, and he could see into its dim interior now that Maria had emerged. Elena was there, lying on her side on a bed of pine branches, and one look told him why she hadn't come out to greet them. Her face was pale and drawn with pain, and her left leg was wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been white but were now stained with blood. "Mama hurt her leg when we were running from the water," Maria said, suddenly shy now that the initial excitement of the reunion had passed. "She can't walk very good, and she's been sleeping a lot." Jeremiah approached the shelter carefully, not wanting to startle an injured woman who might see him as a threat. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" Elena's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were unfocused, as if she was having trouble staying conscious. But when she saw him, some of the tension went out of her shoulders. "You're real," she said weakly. "Maria said she heard voices, but I thought—" She trailed off, too exhausted to finish the sentence. "I'm real," Jeremiah confirmed, already assessing her condition. The leg wound looked serious, not life-threatening if treated properly, but definitely beyond his ability to handle in the field. She needed real medical attention, and she needed it soon. "The donkeys," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. "How did you find the donkeys?" "They found me," Jeremiah said simply. "They've been leading me to you for 2 days. Smart animals. Stubborn as hell, but smart. That earned him a weak smile. They saved us when the flood came. We were sleeping when the water started rising, and they started making such a noise, braying and kicking at their stall doors. If they hadn't woken us up— She shuddered at the thought. Maria had been listening to the conversation while scratching Buck behind the ears. But now she moved closer to her mother. "I drew pictures for them," she said proudly, "so they would know where to find us. The drawings." The child had been leaving a trail, marking their passage through the flood zone, with messages only someone who knew the animals would understand. It was the kind of thinking that spoke of remarkable intelligence and courage for someone so young. "You did good, sweetheart," Jeremiah told her, and meant it. "Real good. Now we need to figure out how to get your mama to a doctor." But even as he said it, he was wondering how the hell they were going to manage that. Elena couldn't walk. The flood had cut off all the normal routes to town, and the nearest road that might still be passable was at least 10 miles away through rough country. As if reading his thoughts, Jasper moved closer and looked directly at him, then at Eleanor, then back at him. The message was clear: "We brought you this far. We'll help you figure out the rest." Jeremiah was examining Elena's leg wound more closely when he heard it, a faint crackling sound that didn't belong in the wilderness silence. At first he thought it might be branches settling or water dripping from the chapel's roof, but then he recognized it for what it was: radio static. "Do you hear that?" he asked Elena, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. "Hear what?" Maria piped up, always alert despite everything she'd been through. The sound was coming from inside the makeshift shelter, and when Jeremiah crawled in to investigate, he found an emergency radio half buried under a pile of wet clothing. It was one of the hand-crank models designed for disasters, and somehow it had survived the flood and everything that came after. He pulled it out and turned up the volume, and immediately voices filled the small space. Rescue workers coordinating search efforts, volunteers checking in from staging areas, and somewhere in the mix, a voice that made his blood run cold. "Emergency Response Team 3 to base. We've got a confirmed sighting of the Rodriguez family vehicle approximately 2 miles northeast of Bear Creek Bridge. Vehicle is partially submerged, but appears to have occupants. Requesting immediate helicopter evacuation to the site." Jeremiah stared at the radio as if it had grown fangs. Northeast of Bear Creek Bridge was exactly the opposite direction from where they were now. If rescue teams were converging on that location, if they thought Elena and Maria were trapped in a car miles away from the chapel, "That's impossible," Elena said weakly. She'd heard the transmission too, and was struggling to sit up despite the pain. We left our car at the house when the donkeys warned us. We walked here. Emergency Response Team 7 to base." Another voice crackled through the radio. "We can see movement inside the vehicle. Deploying rescue swimmers now. ETA to extraction point is 15 minutes. Jeremiah felt his stomach drop as the implications hit him. Someone was trapped in the Rodriguez family car. Someone the rescue teams assumed was Elena and Maria, which meant the official search and rescue operation was focused on the wrong location entirely, chasing phantom victims while the real family sat here miles away with no one looking for them. "Mama," Maria said in a small voice, "who's in our car?" Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears streaming down her cheeks. "Your grandmother," she whispered. "Abuela Carmen. She was visiting us when the flood started, and she couldn't run as fast as we could." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. When the flood hit, Elena had faced an impossible choice: try to save everyone and probably lose them all, or take Maria and the donkeys to safety while Carmen stayed behind. It was the kind of decision no parent should ever have to make, and the guilt was eating Eleanor alive. "She told us to go," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "She said she'd be right behind us, but when we looked back, the water was already too high, and the car was the only thing left that was above the flood line. We hoped she'd made it to higher ground, but she hadn't. Carmen Rodriguez had climbed into the family car as the water rose around her. And now she was trapped there, probably injured, definitely terrified, while rescue teams raced to reach her. And here at the chapel, her family was stranded with no way to let anyone know they were alive. Jeremiah grabbed the radio and tried to transmit. But the battery was nearly dead, and his voice didn't seem to be getting through. The rescue teams were operating on a different frequency, coordinating their efforts through a command structure he couldn't access. Emergency Response Team 3 to base. We've made contact with the victim. Female, approximately 70 years old, appears to be in shock but responsive. Beginning extrication procedures now. Carmen was alive. That was something at least. But it also meant the rescue teams thought they'd found the entire Rodriguez family, which meant no one would be looking for Elena and Maria at the chapel. What do we do? Maria asked, looking from Jeremiah to her mother to the donkeys, who had gathered around them like protective sentinels. It was a good question, and Jeremiah didn't have a good answer. Elena couldn't walk, let alone make the trek back to civilization through flood-damaged terrain. The radio was dying, and even if he could get it working, he had no way to know the correct frequency to reach the rescue teams. And with every minute that passed, Elena was getting weaker from blood loss and exhaustion. Jasper made a low sound and moved closer to the radio, as if he understood the significance of the voices coming from it. Then he did something that surprised Jeremiah. He began to bray, loud and long, his voice echoing off the chapel walls and carrying across the water. Patches and Buck immediately joined in, their voices rising in a chorus that could probably be heard for miles. It was the sound of animals in distress, the kind of noise that would make any rescuer stop and take notice. Emergency Response Team 5 to base, a new voice came through the radio. We're hearing animal distress calls from the vicinity of the old mission chapel. Might be livestock trapped by the flood. Should we investigate? Negative, Team 5. All available units are committed to the vehicle extraction. Animals are not a priority at this time. Jeremiah wanted to throw the radio against the chapel wall. Animals not a priority, if they only knew that these particular animals were the key to finding 2 more victims of the flood. But Jasper wasn't giving up. He continued to bray, and now he was moving toward the wooden crate that Buck had carried so carefully all this way. With his teeth, he pulled out the family photograph and dropped it at Jeremiah's feet, then looked at him with eyes that seemed to say, "Show them. Make them understand." That's when Jeremiah realized what the donkey was trying to tell him. The rescue teams thought they'd found the whole family, but they were wrong. And the only way to convince them of that was to prove that Elena and Maria were somewhere else entirely. The radio crackled with static as the battery gave its last gasp of power. Base to all units. Grandmother successfully extracted and en route to hospital. Family reunification will take place there. Stand down from search operations. Stand down. The search was over before it had really begun, and Elena and Maria Rodriguez were about to become forgotten victims of a disaster that everyone thought was resolved. Jeremiah looked at the 3 donkeys, at the injured woman, at the brave little girl who was trying so hard to be strong. Someone had to get them out of here, and he was starting to realize that someone was going to have to be him. The dead radio sat between them like an accusation, its silence more damning than any words could have been. Jeremiah stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and finding most of them wanting. Elena was getting weaker by the hour, her face pale and drawn with pain and blood loss. Maria was being brave, but he could see the fear growing in her dark eyes as she watched her mother struggle. And the donkeys, they were watching him with the kind of expectation that made his chest tight. They'd done their part, led him to the family they'd been trying to save. Now they were waiting for him to figure out what came next. How far is it to the nearest road? He asked Elena, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. 10 miles, maybe 12, she said weakly. The old logging road that connects to Highway 42, but with the flood... She trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. That road could be washed out, blocked by debris or completely impassable. Jeremiah pulled out his grandfather's compass and studied it in the fading light. The brass surface was scratched and worn, but the needle still pointed true north, just as it had for 3 generations of pike men. His grandfather had used it to find gold that was never there. His father had used it to navigate cattle drives across country that all looked the same. Now it was his turn to trust it with something that mattered more than money or livestock. "I'm going to have to carry you," he told Eleanor bluntly. "It's the only way," she started to protest, but he cut her off with a gesture. "I've packed elk out of country worse than this. You don't weigh as much as an elk." It wasn't quite true. Elena was a grown woman, and he wasn't 20 years old anymore, but he'd figure out the details as he went. The important thing was to start moving, while there was still some daylight left. "What about us?" Maria asked, her hand finding Jasper's mane for comfort. "You and the donkeys are going to help," Jeremiah told her. "Jasper's going to carry our supplies, and Patches and Buck are going to scout ahead and behind. Make sure we don't walk into any trouble." "Think you can handle that?" Maria nodded solemnly, and Jeremiah felt a stab of admiration for the kid. 6 years old, and she'd already been through more trauma than most adults saw in a lifetime. But she was still ready to do whatever it took to help her mother. The next hour was spent in careful preparation. Jeremiah fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and the tarp that had sheltered Elena and Maria, creating something that would distribute Elena's weight across his shoulders and back. It wasn't comfortable, but it would work. From Elena's dropped backpack, he salvaged the medical supplies and what remained of their food and water. The donkeys would carry the rest, blankets, the precious wooden crate, and anything else that might be useful if they had to spend a night in the open. As he worked, Jeremiah found himself talking to the animals as if they were human partners in this rescue operation. "Jasper, I need you to test the footing ahead of us. If something doesn't feel right, you let me know. Patches, you watch our back trail. If you see or hear anything that doesn't belong, you sing out. Buck, you stay close to Maria. She's your responsibility." The donkeys seemed to understand every word. Jasper moved to the front of their small group, ears swiveling as he tested the air for scents that might indicate danger. Patches positioned herself at the rear, while Buck moved close to Maria's side. "They really do understand, don't they?" Elena said as Jeremiah helped her onto the makeshift stretcher. "More than I gave them credit for," he admitted. "More than most people would believe." The first part of the journey took them around the flooded areas, following a ridgeline that offered solid footing, but required them to climb higher before they could descend toward the distant road. Elena's weight on his back was manageable for now, but Jeremiah knew it would get harder as fatigue set in. Maria walked beside Buck, one small hand twisted in his rope halter, her other arm wrapped around the stuffed bear. She didn't complain about the pace or ask when they would stop. Just put one foot in front of the other with the kind of determination that reminded him of her mother. They'd been walking for 2 hours when Jasper suddenly stopped and made a low warning sound. Ahead of them, the trail they'd been following disappeared into a maze of fallen trees and churned earth where the mountainside had given way in a massive landslide. "Can we go around it?" Elena asked from the stretcher. Jeremiah studied the obstacle, trying to calculate distances and angles. Going around would add miles to their journey, and he wasn't sure he had miles left in him. The landslide looked recent, probably triggered by the same storms that had caused the flood, and the unstable ground could shift again without warning. But Jasper was already moving, picking his way carefully around the edge of the slide area, testing each step before committing his weight. The old donkey had spent his life navigating difficult terrain, and his instincts were probably better than Jeremiah's analytical approach. "We follow Jasper," Jeremiah decided. "He knows what he's doing." The detour around the landslide took them through country that was both beautiful and treacherous. Ancient pines clung to impossible slopes, their roots finding purchase in cracks between granite boulders. Below them, the valley spread out like a map, the floodwaters reflecting the last light of the dying day. It was during this passage that Maria made her confession. "I was scared you wouldn't come," she said quietly, addressing the words to Buck but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Elena asked from the stretcher. "When I drew the pictures," Maria continued, "I wasn't sure the donkeys would understand, or if they did understand, I wasn't sure anyone would believe them. I thought maybe people would just think they were lost animals and try to take them away from us. The simple faith in that statement, a 6-year-old's belief that her animals would not only understand her messages, but would somehow communicate them to the right person, hit Jeremiah harder than he'd expected. She'd been counting on the bond between herself and 3 donkeys to save her family's life, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. "They're smart animals," he told her, "and they love you." That's a powerful combination. As darkness began to fall, they found shelter in a grove of aspens that offered some protection from the wind. Jeremiah set Elena down carefully and checked her condition. She was holding up better than he'd expected, but he could see that the pain was wearing on her. "How much farther?" she asked. Jeremiah consulted the compass again, though it was more for his own comfort than for navigation. In this terrain with these landmarks, he could find his way by feel and memory. 4 miles, maybe 5. We'll make it." But even as he said it, he wondered if he was telling the truth or just saying what they all needed to hear. His shoulders ached from Elena's weight. His legs were starting to shake with fatigue, and the temperature was dropping fast as night settled over the mountains. The donkeys seemed to sense his uncertainty. They moved closer, forming a protective circle around the humans, their warm bodies blocking the worst of the wind. Maria curled up against Buck's side, using his bulk as a windbreak, while Patches and Jasper stood watch. In the growing darkness, with nothing but the stars and his grandfather's compass to guide them, Jeremiah found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. 48 hours ago, he'd been a man who prided himself on needing nothing from anyone. Now he was part of something larger, something that demanded everything he had to give, and might still not be enough. But as he looked at the sleeping child, the injured woman, and the 3 animals who had made this rescue possible, he realized he wouldn't change a single decision. Whatever happened next, he was exactly where he needed to be. Dawn came with thin grey light that revealed how far they still had to go. Jeremiah woke stiff and sore, but Elena was worse, her face ashen, breathing shallow. The makeshift bandages around her leg were soaked with blood that had turned dark overnight. They needed to move fast. The compass pointed north, but the landscape had been changed by flood and landslides. Familiar landmarks were gone, making what should have been a straightforward descent to the logging road into a puzzle of unstable terrain. Jasper solved it for them. The old donkey had been ranging ahead while the humans slept, and now he stood beside something that didn't belong. A simple wooden cross, weathered grey with age, marking a grave carved into the mountainside. "I know this place," Elena said weakly when Jeremiah described Jasper's find. "It's my grandfather's grave, Abuelo Miguel. He died when I was Maria's age. The grave marker was humble but enduring, carved from local pine and anchored in a cairn of stones. Someone had maintained it over the years, keeping weeds clear and wood treated against weather. The inscription read, Miguel Rodriguez, 1923-1987, beloved father and grandfather. He was a shepherd, Elena continued. He knew every trail in these mountains. When I was little, he told me stories about a cave he'd found just below this spot where he'd shelter from storms with his sheep. A cave. Jeremiah studied the rock formations with new eyes. If there was shelter near the gravesite, it would explain why Miguel Rodriguez had chosen this spot. Shepherds understood the value of protection. "Maria," he said gently, "do you remember stories about your great-grandfather's cave?" The little girl nodded. "Mama said it had fresh water inside, big enough for people and animals. But I never saw it. Patches had been exploring around the grave and made a soft sound. She stood beside what looked like fallen rocks, but Jeremiah could see they'd been carefully arranged to conceal an opening in the mountainside. "There," he breathed. Working together, they moved enough stones to reveal the cave entrance. It was bigger than expected, tall enough for a man to walk upright, wide enough for donkeys to enter comfortably. The air flowing from the opening was warm and carried the sound of running water. Inside, the cave was a marvel. The ceiling was high and dry, supported by stone pillars carved by centuries of flowing water. A spring bubbled from the back wall, feeding a clear pool before disappearing into a floor crack. Someone had built a simple stone fireplace near the entrance, with dry branches still stacked nearby. "This is where we make our stand," Jeremiah said, settling Elena on pine branches beside the fireplace. "This is where your family comes when trouble finds them." Elena's eyes filled with tears. He knew. Somehow Abuelo knew we'd need this place. That's why the donkeys brought us here. They remember the old stories. Even in their sanctuary, Jeremiah knew Elena needed medical attention he couldn't provide. The nearest road was miles away, and he wasn't sure she could survive another day without proper treatment. That's when Jasper made his announcement. The old donkey stood at the cave entrance, ears pricked forward, listening to something humans couldn't hear. He stepped outside and began to bray, not distress calls, but something different, something like a signal. "He's calling someone," Maria said suddenly. Then Jeremiah heard it too, an answering call from down the mountain. Another donkey or mule responding to Jasper's voice. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the logging road. "There's someone out there," he said, hardly daring to believe it. "Someone with pack animals." The calling continued for several minutes, a conversation in ancient language. Jasper would call, listen, then call again. Patches and Buck joined in, their voices rising in harmony that echoed off mountainsides like a chorus of hope. Then came the sound they'd prayed for. A human voice, distant but clear. "Hello? Is someone up there? Do you need help?" Maria scrambled to the entrance and shouted, "Help! We're here! My mama is hurt." The response was immediate. "We're coming!" "Stay where you are!" Jeremiah felt his knees go weak with relief. After 3 days of struggle, help was finally coming. But more than that, the donkeys had called for it. Through instinct or intelligence, they had communicated across miles of wilderness and found the one person who could answer. 20 minutes later, they heard hooves on stone. A figure appeared leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. An old man, maybe 75, with weathered brown skin and eyes holding lifetime calm. "Elena?" he said, voice thick with emotion. "Mija, is that really you?" Elena's face transformed with joy. "Tio Carlos, but how did you—" "The animals told me," Carlos said simply, entering to check Elena's leg. "Old Jasper's been calling to my mule since yesterday. I knew something was wrong." Carlos was Elena's great-uncle, Miguel's youngest son. Like his father, he knew these mountains like city streets. He'd been searching since the flood began, following old trails and trusting the ancient communication network connecting all working animals in the valley. "I've got medical supplies and know a way to the road," he said. Unpacking his mule, Carlos worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades dealing with mountain emergencies. His weathered hands moved quickly but gently as he cleaned Elena's wound and applied fresh bandages, talking quietly to her in Spanish while Maria held her mother's hand. "The bone's not broken," he announced after a thorough examination. "But you've got a nasty infection starting. We need to get you to a doctor today, not tomorrow." From his pack he produced antibiotics and stronger pain medication than anything in Elena's emergency kit. But what impressed Jeremiah most was what else Carlos had brought. A proper rescue litter, lightweight but strong, designed specifically for mountain evacuations. "You came prepared," Jeremiah observed. "When Jasper started calling yesterday, I knew it wasn't good news," Carlos replied, securing Elena to the litter. "These animals, they don't make noise without reason. And when I heard 3 voices calling together," he shook his head. "I've been around working animals my whole life." That was a distress call. As they prepared to leave the cave, Carlos pulled out something that made Maria gasp with delight. It was an old leather-bound Bible, its pages soft with age and handling. The cover was embossed with the name Rodriguez in faded gold letters. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother," Carlos told Maria. She carried it when the family first came to this valley. Your grandfather left it here in the cave for anyone who might need its comfort. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she touched the worn leather. I remember Abuelo reading from this when I was little. He said the words had more power in the mountains. Closer to God, the Bible went into Maria's backpack alongside the precious bear, another link in the chain of family history that had somehow led them all to this moment. Jeremiah found himself thinking about inheritance, not just of land or possessions, but of wisdom and love passed down through generations. The journey down the mountain was unlike anything Jeremiah had experienced. Carlos knew paths that weren't on any map, routes that shepherds had used for generations to move flocks between summer and winter pastures. The donkeys followed eagerly, their brass bells creating a gentle music that seemed to guide their steps, but it was the teamwork that amazed him most. Without being asked, Jasper took the lead position, testing footing and watching for obstacles. Patches flanked the litter, carrying Elena, ready to steady it if Carlos stumbled. Buck stayed close to Maria, his steady presence giving the little girl confidence on the steep, rocky trail. "They know what they're doing," Carlos said, noticing Jeremiah's amazement. "My father trained animals this way, and his father before him. It's not just about work. It's about partnership." 2 hours into the descent, they faced their biggest challenge. A section of the trail had been washed out by the flood, leaving a gap of about 8 feet across a ravine. The bottom was filled with churning water and debris, making a fall potentially fatal. Carlos studied the obstacle with the calm of someone who'd solved similar problems before. "There's an old bridge cable about 50 yards upstream," he said. "If we can rig a safety line," but Jasper had other ideas. The old donkey was already moving along the edge of the washout, testing the stability of rocks that had tumbled into the gap. With careful precision, he began placing his hooves on the larger stones, building a path across the ravine, one step at a time. "He's making a bridge," Maria whispered in amazement, and he was. Jasper's weight was shifting the loose rocks into a more stable configuration, while his sure footing identified which stones could bear weight safely. Patches and Buck joined him, working together to create a passage that humans could follow. "I've never seen anything like it," Carlos murmured. "They're engineering a solution." The crossing took 30 tense minutes, with Carlos and Jeremiah working together to carry Elena's litter across the improvised stone bridge. But the donkey's path held firm, and soon they were all safely on the far side of the ravine. "How did they know to do that?" Jeremiah asked. "Intelligence," Carlos said simply. "Real intelligence, not just training. These animals think and plan and solve problems. That's why they were able to find you in the first place." The final descent to the logging road revealed the full scope of the flood's destruction. Entire sections of forest had been swept away, leaving bare earth scarred with the marks of rushing water. But the road itself was intact, and waiting at the bottom was Carlos's pickup truck, equipped with a medical transport setup in the bed. As they loaded Elena into the truck, she grabbed Jeremiah's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." But it was Maria who surprised him most. The little girl wrapped her arms around his waist and looked up at him with serious dark eyes. "Will you come visit us?" she asked. The donkeys would like that. Jeremiah felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built that was finally ready to come down. "I'd like that too," he said, and meant it completely. 6 months later, Jeremiah stood in his workshop, carving letters into a piece of seasoned pine. The wood was smooth under his hands, golden in the afternoon light that streamed through windows he'd added to the cabin's south wall. Windows that looked down into the valley where the Rodriguez family had rebuilt their home, where 3 donkeys grazed in pastures that had recovered from the flood's devastation. The sign he was making would hang over the gate of their shared property land that Elena and Carlos had convinced him to accept as payment for the rescue, though he'd protested that no payment was necessary. "Pike and Family Ranch," he carved in careful letters, each stroke deliberate and sure. Family, it was still a strange word for him to use, but it felt right in ways he was only beginning to understand. Elena had recovered completely from her leg injury, though she still walked with a slight limp when storms approached. She'd returned to her job at the county library, but now she came home each evening to a house that bustled with the kind of activity Jeremiah had thought existed only in other people's lives. Maria had started second grade at the local school, but her real education continued each afternoon when she climbed the hill to Jeremiah's cabin to help with the animals and listen to his stories about reading weather and tracking game. She was 8 now, taller and more confident, but she still carried that same stuffed bear everywhere she went. The bear itself had been professionally restored after the flood, its missing eye replaced and its seams reinforced. But Maria had insisted they keep the red heart that someone had sewn to its chest long ago. "It shows he's been loved," she'd explained, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. Grandmother Carmen lived with them now, her own house having been completely destroyed by the flood. At 73, she moved slowly, but her mind was sharp, and she'd taken charge of teaching Maria the old stories, tales of shepherds and saints, of animals who talked to those wise enough to listen. It was Carmen who'd suggested the name for their ranch, understanding instinctively that Jeremiah needed to belong to something larger than himself. "Family isn't just blood," she'd told him one evening as they watched Maria play with the donkeys in the pasture below. "Family is choice, and you chose us when it mattered most." The donkeys had become local celebrities after their role in the rescue became known. Jasper, Patches, and Buck were featured in the county newspaper, and visitors sometimes came just to meet the animals who'd led a mountain man through floodwaters to save their family. But fame hadn't changed them. They were still the same intelligent, loyal creatures who'd risked everything for love. Jeremiah had learned to read their moods and understand their communications in ways that amazed even Carlos. He could tell when Jasper was concerned about weather, when Patches was worried about Maria, when Buck sensed something wrong in their territory. They'd become his partners in the truest sense, working together to maintain the ranch and protect the family they'd all chosen. The compass still sat on his kitchen table, but now it shared space with other treasures: Maria's drawings, Elena's books, Carmen's rosary, photographs of family gatherings he'd never imagined attending. His cabin had expanded to include a guest room where Maria stayed on weekends, and a larger kitchen where Elena cooked meals that reminded him what home was supposed to feel like. He'd started going to town regularly, not just for supplies, but for the human connection he'd spent so many years avoiding. People knew him now, knew his story, and they greeted him with the kind of respect reserved for those who'd proven themselves when it mattered. But it was the evenings he treasured most. When the work was done, and they all gathered on Elena's porch to watch the sun set over the valley, Maria would read aloud from her school books. Elena would share news from the library. Carmen would tell stories from the old days, and Jeremiah would listen to the sound of family conversation while the donkeys grazed peacefully in the pasture below. Sometimes, on clear nights when the stars were bright and the mountains stood silent against the sky, he'd pull out his grandfather's compass and hold it up to catch the light. The needle still pointed true north, just as it always had. But now he understood that true direction wasn't always about magnetic poles or map coordinates. Sometimes true direction was about following the path that led to love, even when that path took you through floodwaters and over mountains you'd never imagined climbing. Sometimes it meant trusting in the wisdom of 3 donkeys who knew that family was worth any sacrifice. The sign was finished now, ready to hang tomorrow when the county inspector came to approve their expanded operation. Pike and Family Ranch, a name that promised welcome to anyone who understood the true meaning of belonging. As the sun set over the Montana Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jeremiah Pike smiled and headed down the hill toward home.